The Center for Understanding in Conflict welcomes you to The Other Chair, a show that explores the dynamics of conflict. Why do we double down in our position? Together with our guests, we explore how the power of understanding one another can lead to better solutions. We will also share tips for managing your own mediation practice.
I'm Jennifer Sullivan, and I'm a lawyer who wears a few different hats professionally. What really excites me is understanding how conflicts arise and how to help people navigate their way out of them. That's what Phuong Ertley and I will be talking about on the Other Chair podcast.
Hi, I'm Phuong Ertley, and I'm a psychotherapist. I help families and couples understand, address, and heal relationship difficulties. That's why I'm excited to be here with Jennifer Sullivan on the Other Chair.
So you landed in California, and were you planning to go back to the practice of law, or did you think you were done with that?
No, I was done. There was no. California was way too interesting to be thinking about being a lawyer. That was all in the rear view mirror. That was like, that's what I did. What will I do? I had no idea what I would do, but I was really interested in all the stuff that was happening in California and the human potential movement. And so I fell in with a guy named Harry Sloan, who was trained in psychosynthesis, which was started by a guy named Roberto Assagioli, who was a contemporary of Freud and Jung's. Harry did these groups at Esalen, and I went to one of those groups. The name of the group was "You Don't Have to Suffer to Feel Good." And it was 5 days of intensive looking at ourselves and interacting, and my mind was just completely blown by Harry. I mean, Harry said at one point, as I was kind of weeping about my life and trying to figure out how to come to terms with, what I was going to do, I was in love with Trish, but it was like it wasn't clear what was going to happen with us, and feeling guilty about my divorce. And Harry said, well, you have a choice about where you can focus. What? I have a choice about where I can focus? It was just completely, my mind exploded at that idea. And it felt really true. So I did continued work with Harry, and went into training at this Psychosynthesis Institute, which actually turned out to be a cult. But really smart, terrific people, amazing what they were doing. This is 1975, working really closely with Harry, and that's where I met Jack. Jack was also, and by that time, as I was doing a lot of deep psychological work, what I realized was that the deeper I went, the more I realized I couldn't turn my back on the law. That was also a part of me as I found my depth, but I just didn't feel like there was a place for me in being a lawyer. Well, Jack had the same impulse. He had come from working against the death penalty and NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and with Tony Amsterdam, they were responsible for the death penalty being, at least for some time, held to be unconstitutional, and stopped for some long period of time. Anyhow, Jack came from that. We came together in this training. And then we had this I had this impulse, which was, well, why maybe what we could do is change the legal profession so there'd be a place for me in it. Because what I was really thinking, and of course you could think like that in the middle 70s, that we could actually change things. Change was so much in the air, and change things so there'd be a place for me, and that just felt like the problem wasn't necessarily just me. It was the profession, and maybe there needed to be some change. And Jack had the same idea. And he said, well, look, I agree with you, but because he was also then teaching at Columbia Law School, he said, let's do law professors first. If we want to change law, we need to start with law professors because that's where it all starts.
I love this. And I have to say, I find it so striking because I didn't grow up. I mean, I was alive in the 70s, but I wasn't coming of age in the 70s, so I can't imagine it. But I did go to law school. And when you go to law school and you learn about the law, it's all based on precedent. And it's all based on we do things this way because it's been done this way before. And so the idea that you would have not only that training, but a lifetime of growing up in this profession or adjacent to the profession, and then have this revolutionary kind of thought that, you know, you could change the profession, and then to plot together with Jack to think about how would you go about doing this methodically, starting with law professors. I find that just amazing. I have a hard time imagining your mindset at that point that enabled you to think in this way.
Well, the mindset was anything goes. You know, we'd found this.
I wanted to comment on the setting for this revelation, right? You're probably sitting around in the hot baths, overlooking the ocean, high on some substance, right in the middle of Big Sur, which is actually sacred land for the Esalen people.
Yes.
So and then the people you were hanging around with were the luminaries of the human potential movement, right? Virginia Satir going through, Fritz Perls going through, and just all these people who were daring to change the structures in which they came from, like changing psychology, changing education, changing how we view the body. It's all of these people were stewing in the same pot.
And not only that at Esalen, but where I was living in Muir Beach they called it kind of Esalen North. So on the street where I lived, was across the street was Sam Keene, who wrote this book called Faces of the Enemy, and he was an editor of Psychology Today. And Will Schutz, who was kind of founding guy of having all this idea about joy and how people could be responsible for themselves, and Joseph Campbell came to hang out with them, and Ken Wilber, and so that it was an incredible time of ferment and really exciting people, and one of the people that was really exciting, who was at Esalen. Because when Jack and I, when we got this idea, Jack was able to get a grant from the National Institute of Mental Health for $500,000 to see if we could change law professors' attitudes, and they were just interested. And there was a woman named Janet Letterman who was actually very close to Fritz Perls. And she was Fritz Perls without the meanness. Although she had her own meanness, she was very, congruent, we thought, with, we learned so much from her and Harry and all these other people. And meanwhile, the Psychosynthesis Institute was becoming a cult, and we didn't quite, as we were understanding what that was, we realized that they tried to control us. There was no controlling us, and so we actually ended up using our legal skills, bringing the Psychosynthesis Institute down, and it was that they become a graduate school, and we became part of it. We kind of persecuted them with representing the students and realizing that they couldn't stand having truth out, and so the students wrote a letter to the other students, and overnight the people in the institute, the leaders, just got into a caravan and left, and it all disappeared like that.
Wow.
So
you ran them out of town.
Yeah, and it was right around the time Jim Jones and People's Temple and cults. There was and so all this business about brainwashing and for us it was understanding that we were not going to be giving up our power to anybody from the outside, and we were actually quite full of ourselves, but we were able to gather together these great law professors who were really excited about this idea. The idea was we called it actually the humanistic educational psychology is what we called it at the time, and so we had this law conference. Does humanistic educational psychology have any relevance to the teaching of law? And it turns out we had really exciting people in the law professor world, and Howard Lesnick from Pennsylvania, and Paul Brest, who became the dean at Stanford Law School, and Charlie Halprin, who had started a center, health center, mental health, in Washington. They all came for these weeks in the mountains, actually in Colorado, Devil's Thumb Ranch. And of course we brought Janet and all the people that had been teaching us. We brought them to these 2 weeks, and we said, just do it. And Janet, when you let her loose, it was like, who knew what was going to happen? It was terribly scary stuff. But what she did is am I getting too much into this?
Well, no, I want to know, but I don't even know what humanistic educational psychology is, and I'm wondering if all of these law professors who came, did they know, or how did you explain it?
Yeah, well, we wrote a paper on it, and then there was a conference where we talked about it. It was all in very academic terms that we described it. But there was this, thing brewing, this incredible dissatisfaction. I mean, lawyers and law professors were really unhappy. A lot of them were, and actually still are, with what they were doing. And so it touched a nerve. And we had all this money, and so we actually went around the country and interviewed everybody that wanted to come. And so Janet had us get into groups where, because it was all about learning. We were so verbal, and we did everything. Everything was just heads. All the exchange between people was, and Janet totally understood the body, and so she had us get into, took the words away, and then gave everybody a pillow. And then she said the idea was to acquire as many pillows as you can. And we're in this room, and we're fighting for pillows. And she said, you only have two words. One is no, and the other is mine. And of course, it was property law, right? That the whole basis. And so we experienced with our bodies all these things that we were teaching in classrooms in a visceral body level. And it was actually the second year into that the evaluators, a guy named Amitai Etzioni, I guess he's a very famous evaluator from Washington, he kind of took the measure of what was going on, and he said, this is really interesting what you're doing. But what difference is this going to make? How is law going to be, how are law students going to be any different? We can see these law professors are changing, but how are law students and lawyers going to be any different? And what will this look like? And we said, we have no idea. And he said, well, if you want to keep being funded, I mean, we had 5 years of funding, but this was just a year or two into it, you better find out. And that's when we decided I'd hang out a shingle as a kind of lab rat to see what happened when somebody with a kind of different attitude practiced law. And so
So you weren't just hanging out your shingle because you needed to make some money and you thought, I'll use my law degree to do it. You were also interested in figuring out whether there was some different way to practice law using these ideas?
Well, of course, I didn't know if there would be any way to practice law using these ideas. But I did need the money because we had a house, and of course it cost nothing to live here then. But still, I did charge $30 an hour, but I had, as I was doing the work with clients, I made two commitments. One was I wasn't ever going to do anything that didn't seem right again. And secondly, I was willing to question all the assumptions that I had about being a lawyer. That was it. Everything else was up for grabs. And so I just hung out a shingle with that. But of course, there was Jack, and there were these other people around the country. And sometimes I would, record sessions with clients and send them to them. Almost always, even though Jack and I, we were on opposite sides of the country, but we talked every day. And so a mediation actually was just one experiment about, this people that came to me and they said, can you help us do a divorce? And of course, it was the one area I'd been a litigator, but I had almost no experience in family law. So I said, I could be lawyer for one of you and the other could be your own lawyer, and then I could help you negotiate something. And the wife turned to me and she said, well, I thought you were supposed to be different. You just sound like all the rest of them. Why can't you just be there for both of us, be in the middle, and just help us find our way through this? And I was stunned when she said that, because I didn't realize how wedded I was to my forms of being a lawyer. And so I said, you know what? You've said something that's really interesting. I need to think about it. Come back in a week. And so they did. They came back in a week. And I said, I think you're right. I think that there should be a way that as a lawyer, I can help you find your way through all of this. The only thing is I have no idea how to do it. So we'll have to figure this out. It's kind of like with my Oakwood students. We'll have to kind of figure this out together. What's helpful, what's not so helpful. And in those days, it was like, people were so worried about the power lawyers had over people. And I was really kind of dedicated to empowering people. I think that was the thing that really touched me the most about not having lawyers run people's lives. And so that was really deep in me at the time. And so we did it. And it was using all the stuff I'd been learning from all from Harry and Janet and all the people that I'd been learning from, and incorporating all of that into working with them. I remember leading them in a guided fantasy about being on a green field 20 years from then, and with their kids, and what they wanted that to look like. And they found this kind of idyllic relationship that they wanted to have, and that kind of helped them find their way through their conflict, which was really strong. So it was really brave people that came to me in the beginning, because
so very brave, Gary. I just love hearing these stories and hearing the players that influenced you, because I really sense this strong hybridization of what was happening in psychology and spirituality at that time, infusing into your work. You were combining all these things that at that time were so popular, the pillows, right? That's Fritz Perls,
right.
Just acting out your pillows and your feelings, and this sense of visualizing, right? And that's a lot of solution-focused psychotherapy at the time were using those sort of tools. And this really profound belief of the person who's coming to you isn't a one down position from you, but as your equal, and that they are the expert into themselves. That's a profoundly humanist sort of viewpoint. So I just love how you just took all these things that you lived and you breathed and you cried over, and all that somehow became translated, through the filter of law and into the way you were working with in this new way with these new people you were working with.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I never met him, but Carl Rogers, of course, had such a profound understanding of what it means to be an equal partner with the people you're trying to help. That all the stuff that he wrote was very profound, and it was actually changing. We were very impacted by him. There were so many people in those days, but Rogers really, I thought, had captured the essence of the relationship between a professional and a client.
Yes, and for the people who need the context for that, Rogers founded the client-centered movement. So prior to Rogers, if you think of Freud, he's the expert and you're lying down. So there's the clear delineation between expert and recipient. Carl Rogers came into the room and he would take all that mystique away about being the expert, and he would just profoundly listen to you and be with you and to regard you with such respect and love. He brought love into the room. And so he had a very minimalist approach, and he was famous for not saying much at all and just saying, uh-huh. And through that process of being heard, people would come to their own awakening or own conclusions or own solutions.
Yeah, he really believed, and this is the fundamental thing that impacted us, me as a mediator, that people actually had better answers to their lives than anybody from the outside ever could. And that is actually the most profound underlying principle of mediation. To really believe that people, and when you believe it as a professional, they experience that belief. And so even if they don't believe in themselves, when they feel this person looking at them with this kind of unconditional positive regard, is what he called it, it's or love, that in fact they started to discover that in fact they did have answers inside them, and those answers were better answers than anybody from the outside ever could have. And that was the most profound insight to me that came out of the whole humanistic educational psychology movement.
So you'd had the opportunity to learn about how people, could resolve their own problems, or at least, that people should be responsible for could be responsible for their own, what's best for them in their own lives. I'm not saying this very well, but what you were learning in California was very different from what you'd learned in law school, and how to resolve disputes through the law. But I'm still kind of fascinated by the fact that, first of all, this friend of yours said this to you. I mean, usually when people come in for legal advice and you say, I'm a lawyer, I can represent one of you and somebody else will have to represent the other, the person would say, okay, that's how it's done. So I'm struck, first of all, that you had this friend who was like, that's not what we want. She knew what she wanted and it wasn't that. But I'm also struck by the fact that you still had, you're immersed in this world that you're learning about with humanistic but you still were aware of this whole network of rules, that govern what lawyers can and can't do. And so it was very brave for you to strike out and say, well, I'm going to try this different role that isn't contemplated by the, rules of professional conduct.
Well, it might have seemed brave, but, I had so much support. There were these law professors. These were important people all over the country that kind of were touched by the same kind of bug. And of course we had the same idea about relationship between teacher and student as we did between lawyer and client. We were trying to level the playing field. So teachers were there in that kind of Rogerian stance, realizing that they're not going to operate in this heavy authoritarian way, and that was going to be much more effective for their students to learn. So they were. So it didn't seem brave. It seemed like, to me, there was no other way to do it if I was going to be, my fledgling new law career was going to be anything. It would either be that or give up, because there was no going back. And of course, you can imagine my father, how completely offended he was by my new life, and he believed the only real lawyer is a trial lawyer, and so he was so profoundly disappointed that couldn't understand at all what I was doing and why I was doing it, and it just seemed all crazy to him. So it was. But I had rejected the East Coast, and I had rejected authority, and it was the times when when it was Chicago Convention 68, there was so much ferment around the country, and the convention was 68, but now this was the aftermath in the 70s. So we're still feeling it. It was still the times of we're going to really change things. Now, when did Lyndon Johnson quit? No, that was in the 70s. Yeah, so we had that. Johnson quit. The Vietnam War was wrong, ending the major dispute my father and I had for all those years. And then what we thought was America was fully changed and would never go back. And we were part of it, and the Institute, Psychosynthesis Institute, was part of it. There was so much potential, and what was amazing is how people gave up their power to this cult. It was really kind of astounding to see our friends and people we respected almost like zombies. And it reminds me of that as we're seeing some of these people on the far right now. Speaking about things that are not true at all, and smart people believing things that are not true because they're told by people that they are true, and so we've been through this, and seeing always thinking, gee, with these people are how could it be that they would see things so differently, and especially when they're being told things that have no basis in truth at all. And that's how it was. The relationship was so strong, and the desire to please and yield to authority was so strong that they lost themselves.
Yeah, and it sounds really contrary to what the Psychosynthesis Institute was teaching to begin with.
As one of my favorite stories about Jung is Jung said, "I'd never be a Jungian." And because they didn't like what was happening, and you could and Massagioli, he was kind of an old man by then in Italy, but I think he was not aware at all of how his really beautiful ideas were being used in this horrible way to kind of subjugate people and have them lose their own sense of themselves.
Well, so going back to when you started trying to mediate with this one couple, and then I understand there was an investigation that happened soon after that.
Yeah.
So you weren't the only. You had some friends to call on to talk to the bar folks about why this made sense to have this new role be recognized. Can you talk about that?
So, lawyers in the early days, when they would hear about me and clients would tell them, they were profoundly upset, and they said, they complain to the bar, what you're doing is illegal. You can't do that. You can't represent two people at the same time with conflicting interests. And so it's unethical, it's illegal, and we're going to investigate. And I remember having some conversation with one of them, saying, I actually think that what I'm doing makes a lot of sense. And so if there's a rule that says I can't do this, you have to change the rule. And by the way, this doesn't look so good for the Bar Association trying to protect its own. And it looks like, so please, investigate me and we'll make it public. I think people will really be interested in hearing about what you're doing. And they went away after that because it was too politically hot for them to kind of go after me. But there was a huge anti-feeling, anti-me. And I think I was probably in circles, ridiculed, but it didn't matter. I wasn't part of the club, so I wasn't even hearing all the bad things they were saying about me, just occasionally filtered through clients. My lawyer said, don't come to Gary Friedman. And so that's why we're here, because I figured if my lawyer said don't come, that there must be something that you're doing that's interesting. I would get things like that, because people were wanting to be empowered and they were sensitive to lawyer domination, and that was changing. There was a lot of stuff being written about that.
So that's so important to understand, Gary, because often when we think about bucking the structure, right, there's always a David and Goliath sort of picture where, the structure, the Bar Association is Goliath, and here you are, little David. But what you're saying is the contrary, is that the tenor of the time, the zeitgeist of the times was on your side. There was such a swelling, a feeling among people around you that things weren't working, that gave you the confidence to say to the Bar Association that, okay, let's expose this. Let's talk to the people and see what happens.
Well, and of course, we can't leave out the fact that I was in Marin County. So Marin County is right, yeah. So there was a lot of feeling like that in Marin County, and a lot of human potential types here. I mean, Marin County was just filled with therapists and all these people that were tuned into all this stuff. So that was another reason it didn't seem so brave. Because there was.
And was this also where the second Woodstock happened? In Mill Valley where you live, and so there. Not only was it a location, but like a gathering of people who believed in these ideas.
There was the Grateful Dead. There were all these people that were attracted coming here. Sweetwater, an incredible place for anybody who was anybody coming into town in the music world in those days would want to stop at Sweetwater. And so there was tremendous swelling. And of course, it wasn't just law. It was the other professions. And, so
everything else, yeah.
Yes.
Thank you for listening to our very first episode of The Other Chair. Fong and I really loved talking to Gary about his personal journey from being a bulldog litigator to finding a new way to practice law, one that eventually became known as mediation. There are so many interesting influences that informed this evolution of his, and his eventual focus on what Gary calls the peculiar power of understanding, which is its ability, even when people disagree, to expand the possibilities available to them for a resolution to their dispute. We hope you will join us next time as we continue this rich conversation. In the meanwhile, if you want to learn more about the Center for Understanding in Conflict, please visit our website at understandinginconflict.org. You can also find us on Facebook or LinkedIn at Understanding in Conflict, or on Twitter at Inside Conflict. Thank you, and see you next time.